All right, well, it's time for us to move our attention to the book of Proverbs, which we've been going through for the last 5 weeks or so. And today's theme we're going to be unpacking in the book of Proverbs is the theme of kindness. And so the sermon title is The Wisdom of Kindness. Now, a while ago, I went down to get a haircut at my local barber in Croydon, and I don't know if you ever have this experience, but you end up chatting to the person who's cutting your hair. And I was sort of quite intrigued by this person and asking lots of questions. And he shared with me that he was in the middle of his assessment. He was really into martial arts and he was getting assessed to be a black belt. And so I was thinking, what does that involve? And so I'm asking questions, and it sounded like, I think it was about a week-long process. And every day there was things he had to do, and there was training, and there was all sorts of demonstrations of his skills that he had learnt. And I was just really interested because I had no idea what it actually involved. But there was one thing that he shared that he had to do that really was surprising to me. He said, in order to pass my black belt, I have to do 100 acts of kindness. And he had to journal these down and record them. And I just found it really, I didn't think this would be a part. You sort of think of martial arts, fighting, but there was something about kindness that they thought was especially important for a black belt to have. And I wanted to share this because I think sometimes when we think about kindness, it feels like a bit of a airy, fairy topic, sort of fluffy and light. But maybe it's something deeper than that. And maybe it's something that requires a bit more strength and is something that has the potential to make a bigger impact than that. And I find it quite an amusing picture, these sort of expert martial arts people sitting down and discussing how they help some old lady across the road or these different things that they might have done. And so today we're going to be looking at kindness and really trying to get to an understanding about why kindness is important and the powerful impact that it can actually have in our lives and in the lives of those around us. And so we're going to be looking at 3 proverbs. There's lots of proverbs on the theme of kindness. We're going to look at primarily 3. And so here's the first one that I want to share with you. So it goes like this. If your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat. If he is thirsty, give him water to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head, and the Lord will reward you. Now, back in the ancient world, hunger was often used as a weapon in warfare. And a couple of weeks ago, Fraser shared with us the importance of having a well-constructed wall around your city in those days, because there was often the nations were fighting against each other. And so what would happen when a nation would go to war, they would come and attack the city and everyone would run inside. And so one of their common strategies was they would cut the city off and they would surround it, not let anyone in or out, in order to make the people inside run out of their resources. And so hunger was this weapon that was used. But the surprising thing about this proverb was it flipped this whole thing upside down. And so if your enemy is hungry, instead of making them more hungry, show them kindness. Feed them. If they're thirsty, give them something to drink. And do the opposite of what you would have expected to be done. And then there's that very interesting line there. In doing so, you will heap burning coals on their heads. Now, what does that mean? When I tried to read up about this, there's quite a bit of disagreement about what this exactly means. And I haven't come to an exact conclusion here, but when you think about burning coals, it sounds at least a bit of a painful experience, doesn't it? And what could be painful about having kindness shown to you? Maybe it's when you've done something that is cruel and you're confronted with the fact that those people are responding in kindness. It kind of shines the light on your own actions in a way that would be quite difficult as you wrestle with that. But the thing about this, and I don't think this is the purpose of this kindness is to inflict more pain on your enemy. I think there's actually a more profound desired outcome from this. And I want to share with you a story that kind of shows why this kind of approach might be impactful in dealing with a hostile situation. So in the book of 2 Kings chapter 6, we find this really interesting story. There's the prophet Elisha, and he has this servant, this young servant who's with him. And at this time, the nation of Israel is at war with the neighboring nation, the Arameans. And they've been coming in, and they've been raiding their towns and villages, and they've been treating them cruelly and really oppressing them. So the people are afraid, and the people are really oppressed by what's going on. And so one morning, this young man gets up, and he goes and he walks out the gate of his city, and to his horror, the whole city is surrounded by the enemy army. And he panics, and he races back to Elisha. And Elisha, we're being surrounded. We're going to die. This is terrible. And he's just panicking. Now, Elisha does something interesting. He prays 3 prayers. And these are really like big, bold, radical prayers that I've probably not really prayed prayers quite like these ones, but this is what he prays. The first thing he prays is, God, please open the eyes of my servant. And we've talked about this part of the story in a previous sermon. And so, open his eyes, not just his physical eyes, but his spiritual eyes. And he looks out and he sees that surrounding this army that's surrounding them is another army, a heavenly army of fire, of fiery horses and chariots. And this man's just like, wow, we are not alone, but we are actually in the majority here. That's prayer number 1. Prayer number 2, Elisha says, God, please strike our enemy with blindness. And this time it's literal blindness. And suddenly, the entire Aramean army that's around them goes completely blind. Now, this must have been a terrifying experience for them. And they suddenly don't know where they are or what's happening. There's confusion, there's fear. They're reaching out and they're trying to find their way around. And so Elisha does something really interesting. He goes to them. They're actually there to capture Elisha. But he goes out to the army and he's like, hey guys, follow me. I'll take you where you want to go. And so there's this army that's following. They're blind. They're scared. And Elisha leads them not to a place of safety, but he leads them actually to their capital city, which at that time was Samaria. And he leads them inside, and now they are blind, vulnerable, and surrounded by their enemy army, the Israelites. And then there's prayer number 3. Elisha prays, now God, make them see again. And suddenly, all of their eyes open, and all of them can see. And now they're the ones that are shaking in their boots or in their sandals. They're terrified, and they're wow. And they realize that this is probably the end of the road for them. And so the king of Israel, he goes to Elisha and he says this. It says, when the king of Israel saw them, he asked Elisha, shall I kill them, my father? Shall I kill them? And this is what Elisha says. Do not kill them, he answered. Would you kill those you have captured with your own sword or bow? Instead, set food and water before them, so they may eat and drink and then go back to their master. Here's this proverb literally being played out in this story. And so that's what they do. It says, so he prepared a great feast for them. Not just the rations, not just the scraps, but they put on a feast. Imagine what this would have been like for these warriors to be there, having come to capture their enemy. Now, they're eating a feast with their enemy. Would have been a baffling experience for them to have. And then, when they finished, they sent them on their way and they returned back to their master. Now, what impact do you think this would have had on the lives of those warriors and those men that had come to attack them? Well, let me share with you what happens, what Scripture says next. It says, so the bands from Aram stopped raiding Israel's territory. Now, if they had have chose a different path, if they had have killed their enemy in this moment, what might have happened next? Well, it depends how much of the army was actually there, but this would have just been another fuel on the fire of this conflict, and it would have just escalated to the next level. Probably. But instead of conquering their enemy, they managed to actually, at least for this next season, to conquer the hatred of their enemy. And here's the thing about violence. No amount of violence can conquer hatred. And this is something that I think we see in our world, especially at the moment. We see nations and there's wars going on where there's violence going one way and then there's a retaliation of violence and back and forth it goes. And as this happens, the hatred only multiplies more and more and more, and it gets more and more ingrained. But that doesn't actually bring peace. For peace, you actually need to deal with the hatred itself, which is a much more harder thing. And I think this is the heart of this wisdom that we find there in the book of Proverbs, is if you want to conquer hatred, one of the most powerful weapons that we have is actually kindness. Now, we've been looking at this from a really big perspective with nations and wars and things like this. But I think this also plays out in a much smaller version in our day-to-day relationships as well. And this whole sort of going back and forth can happen in a way that really takes great relationships and leads them down into a place where they fall apart. And sometimes it looks like this. Say there's two people, and one person, they do something or they say something that is not very kind or not very loving. And it might not be out of hatred or anything like that, but it's just not very thoughtful and hasn't really considered the other person. Now, the other person, when this happens to them, they don't feel loved in that moment. And when you don't feel loved, your natural response is to respond in a way that's not loving. And when you respond in a way that's not loving, then the other person also feels unloved. And so their natural response is to respond in a way that is even more unloving. And then the person over here feels even more unloved. And they respond in a more unloving way. And back and forth it goes, and it goes like this downward spiral that just can pull relationships that were once healthy and wonderful apart. So what do we do? What do we do? How do we break this cycle? Well, I think it sometimes requires an intervention of kindness. It involves, yes, I might not feel appreciated, respected, or loved in this situation, but even though I feel this way, I'm going to somehow dig deep and respond in kindness. And the awesome thing about this is if this takes place, the other person suddenly now will feel a little bit more loved. And when you feel loved, it's easier to respond in loving ways. And then the person over here feels more loved. And this can actually break that cycle and bring that relationship back together. If your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat. If he's thirsty, give him water to drink. There is power in kindness. The thing about kindness as well is that kindness doesn't need to be big to be powerful. Sometimes the smallest little actions of kindness can have the most profound impact. And this brings us to Proverb number 2. In Proverbs chapter 12, verse 25, it says this: anxiety weighs down the heart, but a kind word cheers it up. Not some great action, but a kind word. Doesn't cost anything, but a kind word. Now, I'm sure probably a lot of us here have experienced this, where you have been, whatever it might have been, something is stressful happening, you feel weighed down with life, and things aren't going to plan, and someone speaks a kind word into your life. Maybe it might simply someone says thank you when you've really invested yourself in something. Maybe someone says, I forgive you when you've stuffed up. Maybe it's a compliment. I love that you ... at the right time. When someone says words that are at the right time in the right way, a simple word of kindness can have a dramatic impact upon someone's life. It can actually make their day. It can shine sunlight into the dark situation that they're going through. And the reverse is actually true as well. A simple word, poorly spoken, can crush someone. It could be a harsh word that just, there's no thoughtfulness behind it. It might be a criticism that failed to listen before it spoke. It might be even a good truth that's spoken at the wrong time in the wrong way, has potential to crush someone. I want to share with you a verse. It's a little bit of an intense verse, but it's in James, talking about the power of our words. And James in chapter 3 says this: when we put bits into the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we can turn the whole animal. Or take ships as an example. Although they are so large, they are driven by strong winds. They are steered by a very small rudder wherever the pilot wants to go. Likewise, the tongue is a small part of the body, but it makes great boasts. Consider what a great forest is set on fire by a small spark. The tongue also is a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole body, sets the whole course of one's life on fire, and is itself set on fire by hell. I told you it was a bit of an intense verse. What it's getting at there is it's showing that just the destructive power of a few poorly spoken words. But you know what's true? The reverse of this is true also. A few well-spoken words, kind words, loving words spoken at the right time in the right way can have an equally huge impact upon someone's life. Small things, acts of kindness, can have a profound impact. When I think about the story of Jesus, there's a story that really stands out to me in relation to this, and that's the story of Zacchaeus. So Zacchaeus is this tax collector, and he's really despised with the people. People hate Zacchaeus because he's seen as a traitor. He's sold out their own people, and he's cheating them out of their money, and he's despised amongst the community. And along comes Jesus. And if you're familiar with the story, Zacchaeus is a short guy, and he can't see over the crowd, so he climbs up the tree, and he looks out, hoping just to see Jesus as he comes on by. And along comes Jesus, and he looks up at Zacchaeus, and he says, "Zacchaeus, come down. I'm going to your house." That's all Jesus does. He doesn't even heal him of any sickness or he's not blind or anything like that. Doesn't do anything amazing miracle. He just says a few words of kindness. You know what Zacchaeus does in response? The Bible says he hops down and he has this dramatic conversion experience, transformation that happens. He says, of all that I have, I'm going to give half of it to the poor, and if I've cheated anyone, I'm going to pay them back 4 times. And Jesus is like, salvation has come to your house. And it's this like amazing story of transformation. And you think, what did Jesus actually do? He's like, hey, Zacchaeus, I'm going to come to your house. Like, it's not a big thing. But kindness, even in small packages, has potential to have huge impact. Proverb number 3. Proverbs 11 verse 17 says this: those who are kind benefit themselves, but the cruel bring ruin on themselves. One of the most surprising things about kindness is its ability to bless not only the person receiving the kindness, but even the person who's giving the kindness. I know I've found this to be true in my life. I remember back when I think I was in grade 11 at the time, I went on my first overseas mission trip. And we went to this place in Thailand where we built some water tanks. And like the purpose of the whole thing was to go and bless these people. But that experience had such a profound impact upon my life. And it's probably true to say I might not even be here standing before you today if it were not for the series of events that happened as a result of the experiences that I had on that trip, of how I went there to help someone else and yet found myself being so incredibly blessed by that actual experience. And probably a lot of us have had similar experiences where we show someone kindness and it can give us the most profound boost to our own experience. As I was researching for this sermon, I came across a website called randomactsofkindness.org. And on that website, there's a whole section devoted to the science of kindness. Now, I didn't know there was any such thing as the science of kindness, but apparently there's this whole body of research around the impact that kindness can have not only upon the person who receives the kindness, but on the giver of kindness. And it goes through and it lists all these things, emotional and even physical impacts that kindness can have upon your own life. It can increase your energy, life. It can you can live longer if you're kind. It can increase pleasure, and then oxytocin and serotonin. I don't know lots about all these things, but as I was reading about it, sounds like these are chemicals that can boost your mood, decrease your stress, and make you feel more happy, which sounds like a good thing. And kindness decreases pain, stress, anxiety, depression, and even blood pressure. So that's pretty cool. Another book I looked at, so back when I was at college, one of my lecturers one of my subjects was this guy called Dr. Darren Morton, and he has this book called Live More Happy. And there's a whole chapter that's really devoted to this science of kindness. And there's this really interesting thing that is shared there. Apparently they did this study in the US, and they looked at what are some of the things that give people better chances at being very happy. And one of those things they looked at was, what impact does volunteering just once a week have upon someone's emotional well-being? And they found that alone had an equivalent impact to someone's income going from below 20,000 to above 75,000. So that's basically living below the poverty line to being, in a very different situation. And in the book it says, volunteering once a week can impact your emotional well-being as much as tripling your salary. And so there's something about this that is really has a profound, it's like we're built for kindness, like God has woven this into our DNA. One other quote that really stood out to me said this. So in considering all the studies that have been done on how to boost emotional well-being, former president of the American Psychological Association and widely regarded as the father of the positive psychology movement, Martin Seligman, concluded, "We scientists have found that doing a kindness produces the single most reliable increase in well-being of any exercise we have tested." In other words, of all the things they can find in order to make you feel more happy, the thing that they found that most reliably does that is kindness. How awesome is that? It reminds me of something that Jesus said, and we find this, it's not in the Gospels, it's found in the book of Acts, and Paul's writing this, but he's referring to what Jesus said. It says, "In everything I did, I showed you that by this kind of hard work, we must help the weak, remembering the words of the Lord Jesus himself, who said, 'It is more blessed to give than to receive.'" Jesus tells us that if we live a life of kindness, it actually is going to boost our experience so much as well. So those who are kind benefit themselves. And so, what's the wisdom of kindness? Why should we be wise? Well, there's so many reasons. It's powerful. It transforms hostile relationships. It can break down hatred. It can transform someone's day. It can shine sunlight into someone whose life is weighed down. And it doesn't need to be big. It can be little things. And as a way of finishing, I want to just relate this to the life of Jesus himself. Jesus was the embodiment of kindness. His whole life was a demonstration of what this looks like. Every word he said was kind. Every action he said was kind. He never walked past someone who was suffering without being moved with compassion and reaching out to help them. Jesus was someone whose life was just so kind. It makes me think of one of the situations. So Jesus, he's in the Garden of Gethsemane, and this crowd comes there with the purpose of arresting him to crucify him. This was his enemies. And one of them, thanks to Peter, lost his ear. You might remember this story. You remember what Jesus does? He gets down with gentleness and he reaches out and he touches this man's ear and heals him. The very person who was there to arrest him so that he might be tried and killed, Jesus responds with kindness. And Jesus, when he went to the cross, he faced evil face to face. But he was not overcome by it. But he was victorious over it. He had no interest in destroying his enemies, but he wanted to destroy the thing that had found its way inside of us, that sin and that evil that has plagued our world. Jesus was here to destroy that so that one day we can be back together as a family. Thanks.